The Calgary Flames and Winnipeg Jets are about to square off, and would you believe it? It is first versus first between the Central and Pacific. What should we expect from the rebuilding Calgary Flames? Let's chat about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HOLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, the Jets are about to face off against one of the best teams in the Pacific Division. And no, it's not Vegas, Seattle, LA, any of those teams. It's Calgary. If you would have thought the Calgary Flames would be in first in the Pacific at this point of the season, well, I mean, technically it's not that crazy. But when you really think about the circumstances around the Flames and the fact that this team was not really expected to be doing much of anything, even at the start of the year, their sudden resurgence and generally good play to start the year is really impressive. I don't think anyone thought the Flames might be winning games, let alone being in first. You know, obviously it's only 7 to 8 games into the season, but still a bit of a surprise, right? And I guess, you know, just like the Jets have managed to go 7-0-0, the Flames having such a hot start has put the rest of the division maybe a little bit more on edge. You know, this is still early days and, you know, no one's going to mistake the Flames for a real contender yet, but a much more impressive start than you'd think. So maybe, just maybe, the Flames are not going to be as easy of an opponent as you might expect in other seasons. But we all know from personal experience, whenever the Jets play the Flames, it is always a tight run affair. I want to chat about what's changed for the team and how they've been playing in just a quick minute. But before we go any further, did want to let you know tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, like I said, Calgary is doing pretty well. They're 5-1-1, and you look at their goal differential, you know, they're sporting a +7. They've scored an okay-ish amount, you know, about 26 goals. They've conceded around 19. Nothing too crazy, but this Flames team has been surprisingly resilient to start the year. I don't think anyone really expected them to be where they are. You know, they have Rasmus Andersson really pacing the team offensively, 9 points in 7 games, which I don't know that anyone thought he might be doing this. But, you know, he's followed by some of the more familiar names like Huberdeau, Zari, and Kadri. Zari obviously is, you know, one of their really hyped, I wouldn't really call him a prospect, I guess. I feel like he's got a pretty decent rep now, but Zari is obviously one of the more exciting players. I would still classify him as young enough to be, would I call him maybe like a second-year pro is the more fair assessment. You know, he's had some real experience, but then you're getting contributions from guys like Pospisil, Kuzmenko, even, you know, Anthony Mantha, who I wouldn't have minded joining the Jets. But, you know, this team doesn't really have the sort of offense that screams like a top-end team, right? The Flames are a very, you know, goals and scoring by committee sort of squad. And it's why I think at some point, you know, this hot streak of theirs probably will start to fade. They don't really have crazy offensive depth, but it does sound like they've at least thought about maybe making some acquisitions. Why? Well, let's run through their lines and you might start to get a better picture. The first line is Kuzmenko, Kadri, and Pospisil. And if you ever thought that a first line would look like that for the Flames, maybe in a rebuilding year, yes. For a team that would be potentially making the playoffs, that's probably not sustainable. Pospisil, I think, is probably one of the more surprising parts of this team. He, at one point, was basically just a goon, and we all hate him. You know why? You know, he's injured Perfetti a couple of times, and he's just, I mean, when he's not, you know, playing effective hockey, he can be a bit dirty, if we're being honest. sort of does some of the old Trouba headhunting sort of stuff. Maybe not as much as Trouba does, but certainly not good. So I think his game has really taken strides forward, and hopefully he's kind of moved past just being, a physically oriented power forward who takes cheap shots. Because if he actually just lets his skill take over, there's probably a more well-rounded player in there. Your second line is Zary, Backlund, and Coleman. Obviously, this group has had some underrated skill in, Backlund and Coleman. Coleman being, one of their more offensively oriented players and a guy who, is starting to get older. Same with Backlund. They've both been, for Backlund, a much bigger spine of this team. Coleman, a more recent addition, but Backlund especially has been so underrated and underappreciated over the years, and a real spine to this offense. Zary, I think, is only going to get better and better as time goes on. I guess you could call him Calgary's answer to Cole Perfetti. Your third line, Huberdeau, Kirkland, and Mantha. Very interesting. You wouldn't really expect to see Huberdeau down there. He was signed to a mega deal when he got brought out from the Panthers, but we all sort of knew that contract was not going to age well. But even still, he's managed to become a pretty routine contributor more recently and has seemingly turned his declining form around a bit. Not enough to where he's worth, $10.5 million, but enough to where he's contributing and helping the team. So, good for him. I'm sure, knowing you were being paid that much and not really looking like you were worth the contract probably did weigh pretty heavily on him. On your fourth line, you've got Lomberg, Rooney, and Coronado. Coronado, I think, is a bit of a fan favorite. Lomberg, very much so. It's kind of funny how this team has sort of been, built out of other teams' cast-offs, maybe some journeyman players. And so far, they've really made it happen and have looked pretty darn good. On defense, they've got Ball and Anderson on your first pairing, Uyghur and Miramonov on your second, and Bean and Paschal on the third. So the blue line has a couple of key players like Anderson and Uyghur that I think are really, really good. Everyone else a little less sure on. I think Ball at one point had some pretty nice defensive numbers, but nothing too crazy. And the third pairing, it's there. I'm sure it does fine for what you ask of it. But I think the real story is that, this is not that dissimilar in some ways to how the Jets are constructed. And maybe that's why, this is an interesting opponent for the Jets. They're going to be very closely forechecking. They're going to be tough, physical in the corners. I think, compared to a team like the Kraken, which gave the Jets fits because they were so fast, this is going to be a more deliberately paced, grindy forechecking team that might actually be a better matchup stylistically for how Winnipeg plays. Winnipeg's third and fourth lines are definitely going to match up very well against Calgary's bottom six. The top six will be interesting. The first line really has not been winning as many of their matchups, and the Nemestikov line would be, I guess, expected to sort of equal the Backlund line, and that line has been better in some ways, but it's not great. So you have your skill lines still kind of scuffling so far. The nice thing is that even when they're bad, they still have the ability and skill to pull off some beautiful goals. And I think you saw that in the last game with the Velarde goal and some of the stuff Ehlers has done. But at some point, you really have to get them, controlling the zone, winning their shifts, and outplaying the opponents. Getting those goals here and there in between is great. Don't get me wrong. We all love it. But I think it makes it a lot harder if you're not controlling and wearing down your opponents, because then your depth lines are going to be asked to do that instead for all of their matchups. And that's probably a little more than you want them to handle. In goal, Calgary has been relying on Vladar and Wolf. I don't know that either of these guys is really crazy good. I mean, Vladar has made some really nice saves, and I think at some point Wolf will be a really star netminder for the Flames. But, for the Jets, probably not on the same caliber as like a Hellebuck, right? Wolf at some point may be really, really good, but I think he's still probably figuring out the ropes at the NHL level. So this is going to be an interesting game. I can't say that I have a great feeling about which way it's going to go, but I guess tentatively I'll say 3-2 Jets. I was right when I was in a Discord and said 4-3 Jets for the Kraken, so maybe my prediction streak will hold. But give me your score predictions in the comments below, or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Now, in just a little bit, I did want to take some time to talk about Neal Pionk and why his season has suddenly gotten off to such a hot start. I don't think anyone really saw this coming, but the Jets may be trying to do what they did with Josh Morrissey. We'll chat about that in just a brief moment, but before we go any further, did want to shout out our friends and partners at PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the best place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, PrizePicks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. You just pick more or less on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. And if you're wondering why you should trust PrizePicks, they always put their members first with fast withdrawals that are safe and secure. With PrizePicks, you can get your winnings in as little as 15 minutes. And of course, they offer you some great features like injury protection, right? If somebody gets hurt in your lineup midway through your game, they get pulled, your lineup will still stay live. And of course, if things aren't perfect and maybe you're a little bit worried about, your lineup not doing that well, don't worry. They offer you a flex play. They've actually invented the flex play option, which still allows you to cash out if your lineup isn't perfect. You can even double your money even if one of your picks just doesn't quite hit. And of course, some of the world's biggest community members out there, like Drewski, Joe Budden, and MMA champ Sean O'Malley are playing. And if you want to join them and see what they're up to, you can check out the community plays under the promos tab and join each of these celebrities every week for some of the hottest action on PrizePicks. If you sign up today and get $50 instantly, all you have to do is just play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's just guaranteed. All you need to do is play $5. I mean, that's a fantastic deal. We all love a good guarantee. If you're thinking about what you might try to start off with first, maybe you want to do over-under for Jets goals against the Flames. I would say in this one, let's go over 4.5. I think this is going to be a little bit more of a tighter forechecking game than the Kraken game, but still, at least 5 to 6 goals between these two teams. That's my prediction, but we'll see if that one holds. But again, the only way you can do that and get in on the action right now is by downloading the app today and using promo code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. Hey friends, welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting a little bit about some interesting early season trends. Later in the episode, we're going to be taking a look at, how some of, the top teams are doing out there, what the early standings are looking like. But I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about a very interesting storyline this season that I don't think any of us really expected, and that's Neal Pionk. You know how I feel about Neal Pionk in the past. He's always been one of those players who, on a personal level, I really like. But I know that professionally and based on his performance on the ice, things have been complicated for Neal. He's definitely a very fight for the badge kind of player. And if there's a guy who, often has been more accountable than most you would think, he has kind of been that guy. Like he one year knew that he was really struggling and called his own performance at the end of the season really embarrassing, which, oftentimes I think these guys are a lot more aware than perhaps we give them credit for. You hear them really sometimes harshly assess their own performances. And I think Pionk has always been one of those guys that you can kind of tell when he knows he's really fighting it. And he's trying to pivot his game a little bit. I think as he's getting older and maybe his body is not able to keep up as much as it used to. But this year, there's been a really interesting change to his game, and it's just been a lot of aggression. Offensively, Neal has joined the rush and become basically a fourth forward. When he's on the ice, he's not sitting back and trying to defend, which when he does, it doesn't really work. That's not how his game functions. Pionk is one of those players who's really an offensively attuned guy and actually provides a real fire spark on the back end when he has a partner who can actually clean up and do the rest. And that's why being played with Dylan Samberg has been probably a bigger difference maker than even I've given credit for. Samberg, he's not going to play the flashiest game, And you watch Dylan, and you probably don't recognize it, but he's a better skater and a better transition guy than Brendan Dillon was. That's something that I think a lot of us had really focused in the offseason as to why you might want to have this be a thing. Sandberg, for all that Dillon brought, Sandberg, I think, is just a more versatile player on the back end, and he still brings a lot of really strong defensive impacts. Maybe he's not going to be as stout and as aggressive and physical as Dillon is, but Sandberg brings his own strength and skill, and I think he's been very smart and attuned to the details to start the season. Not perfect like anyone, he still makes mistakes, but with Pionk being able to now really aggressively attack, it's had a really big impact on this pairing. Right now, they are Winnipeg's best blue line pairing. Sandberg Pionk has really led the way, while Morrissey and DeMello have really tanked. And like the third pairing's been whatever at this point. I don't really worry too much about that. Miller's been fine for the most part. Fleury was all right. Stanley has had a tougher start, but I mean, you just sort of understand that that's going to be a thing. But Pionk and Sandberg, they are absolutely cooking. Pionk has 8 points in 7 games, and I know for a defender that's not really the most important thing. You want to look more at how they're doing in their own end as well. And sure, defensively, Pionk is still Pionk. I think the last game you saw him have some really bad turnovers and stuff, and that part of his game isn't necessarily going to go away. But then you'll also see him actively contribute. The game-winning goal in overtime was all because he made a play along the walls and ended up drawing a tripping penalty that led to, the extra man coming on in Ehlers, and we won an OT. And Neal, I think, had an assist or two in this game. And so Pionk's just been really offensively aggressive. He's jumping into the rush, and I love seeing him do that because that part of his game, when he's allowed to roam freely and become that fourth forward, is, a real asset. And actually, I would encourage the Jets, especially as Morrissey and DeMello struggle, to use Sandberg and Pionk more. Bring them on when the first line's out there. Pionk might be able to help Scheifele, Ehlers, or Scheifele, Connor, and Velarde maybe generate a little more offense. If you're going to have that group together, maybe having that fourth player to offer an outlet and really an offensive passing and shooting presence maybe gives them a little more scoring punch, because like that line as is hasn't really been able to get much going at even strength. But if they have somebody who's really aggressive and constantly jumping into the rush, maybe that would help them a little more. I don't know. But Pionk, I would say, really deserves some credit this year. And I think, the change probably is at least due in part to the coaching suggestions. I feel like Winnipeg was like, we were able to do this with Josh in previous seasons under Bones. Maybe we can do the same with Pionk. And so far, it's paid off dividends. His aggression has been really noticeable. He's actually scored a goal as well. And he's just regularly getting some nice point shots in, some smart passes and smart, shots that are then tipped by his line mates and stuff. He's just been really involved in a way that he hasn't been since really the bubble season. And as long as he keeps that up, you really can't hate and complain about his performance. Sure, the defensive side of his game is always going to be a bit of a worry, but I always lean towards the idea that, if you are well outpacing, whatever your deficiencies are because you're giving the team so much else, I don't complain about that. Like, I'm happy with that. Obviously, there'd be some things that you would like them to clean up, but at the end of the day, for me, the most important thing is that you're providing a lot of value more than you're offering your opponents, which is why I, again, still lean on the idea of playing Ehlers more. But, that's a discussion for many other episodes, I'm sure, as we continue to watch his ice time maybe not be where we'd like it to be. But Pionk, all credit to him. Great start to the year. A great start and a quiet start for Sandberg, who I think has really been trying to push the pace a lot more. But, for a team like the Jets that just hasn't always had a blue line that's super well constructed and very deep, it's nice to see that a guy that I was personally concerned about heading into the season has really been able to turn things around. This pairing being as good as it is certainly helpful when maybe some of your other pairings have not been so good. So for the Jets, I'm sure that they're thrilled with this turn of events. I'm sure that they probably did not expect it to, develop and turn into this sort of thing. But for Winnipeg, let's hope it just continues. Now, for the Jets, obviously they are, still cooking and still perfect on the record, on the standings. But a lot of teams out there have kind of kept pace with the Jets. It's been hard for Winnipeg to really gain ground in the Central Division, and I want to chat about some of the early standing silliness. Obviously, this look at the standings is very, very early in the season. But I think if you're the Jets, having such a hot start and banking all of these points early is great because at some point you're going to scuffle. It's just inevitable, right? Teams don't stay hot like this forever. And I think for the Jets, the more that they can pad their lead early, the better it will be when eventually maybe the goals aren't flying quite as freely for the Jets. But we'll chat about that in just a little bit. Before we go any further, though, just wanted to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. We are heading into Week 8, and already LA versus the Vikings has obviously been hugely controversial over a missed face mask. What more could possibly happen? Well, you've got Jameis Winston versus Lamar Jackson. You're going to have some crazy other games. The Bears at some point, you probably wonder if they're going to lose. They haven't really faced many good opponents, but maybe that will finally start to change. Obviously, the shifting sands around the league continue to be hard to predict, but at some point, I really hope the Chiefs lose because I am tired of Kansas City constantly winning. But maybe you're watching one of these teams and you get a hunch about how they're going to do in the middle of the game. You can check out the latest stats and view live play-by-play and so much more on the same page where you're placing your bets, all at FanDuel. And you'll even get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Again, that's $200 in bonus bets guaranteed with your first $5 bet. Only at FanDuel.com. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just chatting a little bit about some of these, standings updates around the league and how teams are doing. And let's start with the East, because the East is probably, in my mind, the weaker of the two conferences. Not that I'm getting like a strong sense of who the, cup favorites are this year. And it's still very early, but, in the Atlantic, you've got the Panthers, Lightning, and Wings currently occupying the first few spaces, but like 2 through 5 in the Atlantic are all tied in points. And like the Panthers have played a couple more games than almost everyone else, so wouldn't read too much into this. But I think if you're, either a Leafs fan or a Bruins fan, you're probably a little concerned about some of the start to the season. And for the Habs, they've just gone through a bit of the ringer, right? They lost Laine before the year even began, and things just haven't really improved. They're at the bottom of the Atlantic and probably on track for another lottery pick. But hey, that's how you start to build your future. So the Panthers will probably be at or near the top. I think that this division is just a little mediocre, but you've got some upstarts in teams like the Sabres and Sens that might start to really push towards the top of the division as time goes on. They're still a little inconsistent. There are still some things in their games that are working out, but I think the Atlantic's going to be really anyone's game this year, and I'm expecting a dogfight all the way to the end of the season for that group. The Metro, very strange division. Right now, you've got the Devils, the Rangers, and the Caps, but the Devils have played almost 5 games more than most of the other teams, and it just seems like thanks to their trip abroad and the fact that the rest of the teams are just starting to catch up on their schedule, it's a little hard to get a real sense of who's pushing towards the top, but the Rangers definitely seem for real. The Rangers are very good. I would say that right now they're probably the top Stanley Cup favorite. That team has, a really, really deep offense, great goaltending, and an improving, blue line group that, now has Fox back to full strength. They added Mancini. There's interesting stuff happening with this Rangers team that I think folks are going to keep a very keen eye on. So something to watch out for. The Caps being in third, they're just fun. They're a little chaotic. I've been watching some of their games. I think that they kind of have some of the same things that the Jets have where, at 5v5, they're a little bit questionable, but, thanks to some timely saves and some fun power play stuff and a couple of real top players really leading the way for them, they've managed to get some, really quality depth contributions to sort of round out what's been a real hot start for them. And I'm sure that they are really trying to rebuild their rep after several years of not really looking like a playoff team. So all fun there. The Canes, Islanders, and Pens are all going to be jockeying for either the middle of the pack or the upper end of the division. I mean, the Canes will probably be, somewhere in the top 3 at the end of the season, but the Islanders and Pens, I mean, yeah, they've got lots of issues and probably no easy ways to fix them. So interesting division, but the Flyers at the bottom, that's just funny. Who could have guessed? Well, actually, quite a few people. Let's be real. The Flyers have not been good for a long time. Now, in the Central, this division, I think, for me, is the best division in hockey. You've got the Jets, the Wild, and the Stars all in your top 3 spots. And then you've got the Blues not far behind this pack. And, everyone is within just a couple of points of one another, which is kind of crazy considering the Jets are 7-0-0 and somehow only 2 points ahead of second place. So I think this year is going to be very competitive. The Preds are all the way at the bottom. They only have 1 win on the season, which was actually tonight. So congrats to them for winning, their first or second game of the year. Not exactly it was their second win of the season. So not exactly a great start to the year for them. Only 2 victories and 5 losses. But hey, I guess the road to recovery starts somewhere. But maybe that's why you don't sink a lot of money into a lot of older free agents. This division, though, is just going to be a mess this year. You've got the Blues hanging around. Utah, if they ever fix their defense, is going to be fun, but they just lost 2 of their guys long-term, so probably not this year. Colorado is also beat to heck at this point, lots of injuries. So the Jets really have a good chance this season of being in the top running for the Central Division title, but we'll have to see how long they can do it with how they've been playing, right? They've kind of been, borderline at 5v5 with some great special teams and goaltending, and that can get them a good deal, but maybe at some point they want to think about some changes to really get the lineup at its absolute strongest. Finally, in the Pacific, you've got Calgary, Vegas, and LA anchoring your top, with the Kraken and Canucks really not far behind. Should be a very interesting division this year. I think it's also very wide open. Even the Ducks are not doing that badly. They're 3-2-1, which I don't think anyone really expected. The Oilers and Sharks being towards the bottom is kind of funny, but even Edmonton, still has 7 points on the season. Once the Oilers start to figure things out and put 2 and 2 together, I would expect them to start pushing towards the middle to the upper end of that table. But, for the Pacific, it seems like it's going to be a wide open field, and I think it's going to be really fun to watch. Some of these teams vying for playoff spots, and, a lot of them play a very up-tempo style of game, which for the Central Division is always a fun matchup. So interesting start to the year. Again, if I had to choose teams that I think are really true cup favorites, I'm probably looking at the Rangers, maybe the Stars. The Jets at some point could start to enter that conversation, but I need to see a little more from them, because we all know how they are in the playoffs, right? That's been one thing that we have a fair bit of sample size on. But maybe in the Pacific you could look at the Kraken or something, but I think it's probably a little too early to get excited about them. Vegas, I think the Knights are going to be another pain in the butt this year. They always are. It's just an annoying team to deal with. And if we face them in the playoffs again, good Lord, I hope we win this time, because losing to them again is just a pain. But let me know who you think your Stanley Cup favorites are. Drop your comments and thoughts below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here next week with a recap of Winnipeg versus Calgary, so don't go anywhere. Have a great night, and as always, go Jets go.